Test. 1, 2. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Right, we are back with our first plenary session. And with us today, the distinguished academic. I promised him that I will not say huge, accolades about him, but Doctor, no choice. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Professor Barry Sullivan. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. You have Ruzaha, Dr. Rafi, the Deputy Director General of Education, Puan Farah, the Director of ELTC, Directors of IPG campuses who are here with us today. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, the participants of ICEL 2022. A short while ago, we had a grand start with the keynote address by our very own Deputy Director General of Education, Dr. Ahmad Rafi. Thank you very much, Doctor, for the wonderful keynote. And now we continue the ICEL 2022 with our first plenary session by a renowned academic who is an award-winning academic, Professor Barry Sullivan. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for information, this session is conducted via the hybrid mode. We have participants who are in the hall, as well as participants at their workplace or homes who will be viewing via our online mode. So as we proceed, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, right, for those who are present here today, you may do so. I believe there are microphones set around the hall. And to those who are online, you can also do so via the chat mode. Ladies and gentlemen, before I proceed, invite Dr. Professor Barry, please allow me to kind of give you a bit of introduction who Professor Barry Sullivan is. Now, Professor Barry Sullivan is the head of assessment, research, and development at the British Council, where he was responsible for the design and development of the APTIS test. This sounds familiar to everyone here, Prof. Exactly. No one's going to blame you, Prof. Don't worry. Right? A wonderful test to test our proficiency, right? And he has undertaken various research across many areas of language testing and assessment and its history, and has worked on the development and refinement of socio-cognitive model of test development and validation since the year 2000. Again, he is an award-winning academic when it comes to assessment. Ladies and gentlemen, he is also an award academician when it comes to another very important mode or what you call a strategy that is also incorporated into assessment, which is with the use of AI, artificial intelligence. Now, I'm going to stop here and not spoil the whole show. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and let us invite Professor Barry Sullivan.
Thank you very much. At the risk of embarrassing an old friend of mine, I'm going to add one more country to her list. I can't believe that she left Ireland off the list. I'm very proud to be an Irishman. My timer is even green. I was very impressed when your Director General arrived with a green tie. I thought, that's a man you can respect. He's properly dressed. If I can be absolutely honest with you, I have no idea what today's talk is going to be about until it actually starts. Because I'm on a bit of a whirlwind tour. It feels a bit like rock and roll. I'm in KL today and Tokyo tomorrow. And I have talks going on about different things, the CEFR, AI, comprehensive learning systems. And this talk, if my memory serves me right, well, is all about fairness and ethics of using AI in assessment. But I wanted right from the beginning to broaden it past assessment. And I think it's very important that we do that. But before we start, I want to think a little bit about the two words in that title, fairness and ethics. And there are things that we really do need to know about them. And when I put them into the title, I probably wasn't thinking, because usually I avoid words like fairness and thinking, and you might ask me why. And one of the reasons is when we think of fairness really is something that means different things to different people in different contexts and at different times. That's the reality. So when you look at the literature, the language testing literature, you'll find books about fairness. But those books are written from a particular perspective, not necessarily a perspective that reflects the perspective that you work in yourself, that reflect the kind of social, educational, political realities that you live in. And we can say the same for ethics. So we want to get that right from the very beginning, that when we talk of fairness and ethics, we're not always singing from that same hymn sheet, as we might say. Fairness involves taking into consideration the learner's needs and characteristics. We often think of fairness also as something similar to equity. So fairness and equity. But how we define it in general, we may agree on. But how we operationalize it in a different context, we will maybe agree or not agree on. We certainly will have different things to consider. We can't expect that fairness or ethics will look the same in every context. And I have a quote from ethics. It's a set of concepts and principles that guide us in determining what behavior helps or harms sentient creatures. Now, that definition even is quite US-based. It's not necessarily something that we would define even in Europe. So even when we come to the different elements of these things, we have to think fairness, ethics, it's all contextually related. We're going to come back to context early and again and again. When we define them in our context, we have to define them ourselves. We can't import necessarily definitions of fairness and ethics. It's something we have to think about right from the beginning and think about right through. So let's think a little bit about AI and assessment now for a while. And when we think about AI and assessment, and it's something that I've been working on now for the last few years, we think about it generally in three ways. We think about it in terms of what can it do to help us with the development process? How can it help us to deliver? And then how can it help us in the scoring? The ones that most people think about are scoring, AI scoring. And we'll come back to that in a little while. But we'll talk a little bit about each one of these three boxes, but I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time, especially on the first two. If we look at AI and language assessment, one of the big mistakes that people make is, and this is a model that was published only a few years ago by some specialists in AI-delivered assessment in ETS in the US. And if you look at that very first box on the left-hand side, it tells you, essentially, the first thing you do when you're creating a test based on technology is you look at the technology and you ask yourself, what can the technology allow me to do? That's a crazy place to start. Because then you're basing yourself only on the technology. What we're supposed to do, we're supposed to be language teachers, language testers, language educators. We should be looking at what do we want to assess in terms of language within our particular context, and what do we want to say about those people who we assess. Not asking ourselves, what will the machine allow us to do? If you remember a comedy show in the UK some years back, it was one of the lines, the famous lines in it was, the computer says no. So everything you ask from this person at a desk that her answer was, the computer says no. So what if the computer says no? What if the technology people say, well, okay, you've asked me to do an interactive communication because you want to assess a person's ability to interact, not just to deliver a monologue. And if the person at the other end says, well, no, the technology won't allow us to do that, does that mean that you shouldn't do it? Of course it doesn't. It means that you find a different technology provider and you ask them to help you to do it. But certainly you don't think about looking at what the technology allows and then basing your decisions on that. So I'm assuming that this is not something that we would ever do. I'm assuming that this model is not a model that we would ever look at. We would always start from the language. And if we're testing mathematics, we'd start with the mathematical principles or science or whatever. It doesn't really matter what we're assessing. So moving along then to think about AI in development. In terms of development, I usually like to think of it in a couple of ways. One way is in, well, what exists, and the other is what's on the horizon, what's coming. So some things are in development, working on various areas, and if your eyes are better than mine, you can see what it says on that slide because I haven't a clue. I'm going to try using my glasses, see if I can actually read some of it. So far away from me. No, useless. Right. One of the problems when you begin to get old is that the bits begin not to work. Sadly, the eyes were the first to go. But essentially what that slide is telling us is that right now, there are certain things that we can do in terms of development. So, for example, we've just been through a very interesting project on AI-assisted text creation. So we use in one of our aptitude tasks, in the reading test, we have a 750-word text. Now, those are original texts. They have to be original texts because of copyright. So if we're going to use that text, it takes a very skilled item writer to write those texts that are original. So they're very expensive and they take a lot of time to write. So we worked with a company who helped us to develop a system where the AI actually helps us by, we have a general structure, 7 paragraphs. We put in our requirement in terms of a theme or a topic. It gives us 6 first paragraphs. And then the item writer will look at the 6 and say, that one is, maybe I'll change a word here and there, but this is good. And then it says accept, and then it gives you 6 more second paragraphs. So the item writer can create a 750-word original text in a matter of minutes. So it's a far more efficient way to do things. What we're looking to do as we move forward is to automatically generate text. But that doesn't happen yet. And anybody who's familiar with 1 or 2 of the tests that are out there in public, where you see automatically generated texts, usually the text is very short, and sometimes it's completely meaningless. It's just daft stuff. You know, and I won't name names, but if you want to ask me later, I'll be very happy to name names off the stage. So there are certain things that we are doing, and things like item difficulty. One of the big problems every test developer has is trying to understand or figure out how difficult is this reading item or listening item or whatever item going to be, so that I can put it into my item bank and then develop a test, and then develop different versions of my test that are equivalent in terms of difficulty. Well, one of our projects is now looking at how we can actually do that. And it's a big challenge, of course, but it's getting there. And it's essentially AI-assisted right now. But eventually, we're hoping that it will have a self-generating system. So we can create the tasks, we can create the items around the reading tasks, and we can estimate the difficulty of those items. And that's a very, very efficient way to create a test. And if you think about it, it has a massive impact on assessment in general, because it means we can move towards what I see as the holy grail of assessment, which is personalized assessment. So we can have a single test going at any one time, and everybody in this audience may be taking the test, and you'll all be seeing different items, because they'll be personalized to your interests, to your level of language, and to your goals. But that's where we're going, and that's the idea of doing it. So we'll move away now from development. We could talk for all day about development, but in terms of delivery, we also have things like AI-assisted and AI-driven. So there's very little AI-driven at the moment that actually works terribly well. If you look at some of the tests that are AI-driven, and there are very few out there, they're very, very primitive tests. They look like, to me, like a test that was developed in the 1950s or 1960s. They're often multiple choice. Testing what? I don't know. I can't really tell. It's very difficult. Somebody who's a psychometrician or a psychologist might try to argue with me that it's testing a particular aspect of reading. But I'm sorry, I've never been convinced, and I don't think I ever will be convinced. So when we're talking about delivery, at the moment, it tends to be an AI-assisted. And that can be things like proctoring. It's quite dangerous to allow an AI-driven proctoring system for a number of reasons. One reason we know is that there's significant bias within most facial recognition systems, which depend on things like color, age, and gender. And you combine all of those and you're in serious trouble. So if you're a dark-skinned, older woman, you're really in trouble. That's the reality of the facial recognition. If you're a young white male, you're laughing. It's perfect. It gets it right every time. The problem is that if you leave it to a machine to make significant decisions, right now the machines are not able to make them in a justifiable way. So there's a massive ethical question around how can you do that. So what we do is we look at the machine suggesting to a human proctor who's also online, maybe you want to look at this person on screen. Maybe you want to look at that person. And the human then makes the decision. For me, that works reasonably well. So AI-assisted works quite well in terms of how we deliver tests. If we think then, moving on to think about the scoring of the test, we have a totally different ball game, because it's really moved on in terms of where things are. And I like to think about it in a number of different ways. So we have essentially three different things to think about, and we'll see the numbers coming up here. And some of these things are related to the development of the scoring, or the design of the system, the development of the system, and some of them are related to the actual delivery of that system. And some of them, the ones that I really am keen to talk about, and we'll go on to talk about it a little bit more today, is how do we know that system is working? How do we know that the AI scoring system is to be trusted, is to be believed? How do we know that there's no bias within the system? Well, that's a massive question. And to be absolutely honest with you, I never really thought about it. I've been around AI scoring systems for about 25 years now, looking at how they've been developed and how they're moving forward. And to be blunt, I've always been really impressed. I think, wow, this is really good, you know. And originally it was for writing only, and then suddenly you had speaking stuff that was coming out, and I think, wow, this is really good stuff. And it was only about 3 or 4 years, well, no, it's 4 or 5 years ago, the old head. It's about 4 or 5 years ago, we started a project in China called ICEL Smart Learning. And this was a project where we developed a learning system, an online learning system, where you could, as a learner, prepare for an IELTS speaking. And the idea was that you would engage with the system, and then the system would automatically score you and give you some feedback and help you to move on and push you towards another part of the system. The problem happened when we started to look at the system and we thought, how do we know that the company we worked with developed a system that's fair and accurate? So we asked them, and their first reaction was, why do you want to know? And we thought, well, we want to know because if we're going to say to people, this is your level, well, we want to be fairly sure that we're getting the right answer. They couldn't understand why we were asking them questions. They couldn't understand why we were questioning their system. And we couldn't understand why they didn't want to tell us. So the reality was we were speaking completely different languages. We didn't know how to ask them in their language what we wanted. And they couldn't respond to us in our language. And it wasn't just because we were working in English and Chinese. We had bilinguals on both sides. It took quite a while for us to develop a communication across the two companies, across the two teams of researchers, until we started to understand that there's a problem here because they haven't really thought about it from the beginning. So what did we do? I don't think scoring matrix is where we're going at this, but we'll talk about it in a minute. I'm going to come back to the point on the scoring, but I'll make a short point on the slide you're seeing at the moment. One of the issues that we had when we looked at this automated scoring system was, to what extent can we trust the AI? And as we were coming to the decisions, we were thinking, well, how would we employ the AI in the first place? And the thinking then came to my head that we need a structure. We need to think about it. So if you look at all of this, we see that number one, level one of this matrix is human-only scoring. So there's no AI, it's humans only looking at it. But if you look at number 6, it's AI-only scoring. So everybody who hopes at some point down the line to employ AI in their system needs to look at this matrix or a matrix like it and make a decision. Where am I going to be? Should my system be AI-led or AI-driven, or should it be human-led or human-driven? Now, in the British Council, what we've come to decide right now is that particularly for higher stakes decisions, it should be human-led. So lower stakes decisions, we don't mind dropping down the line towards a 5 or a 6, but higher level decisions would have to be a 1 or a 2. That's essentially the point. So there's an ethical issue because when I was making this, I had no idea what the problems might be in the scoring systems. So every level of this needs to be considered. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but essentially what it's saying is human only, human advised by the machine, human machine about the same, the human looking at some aspect of the performance, the machine looking at a different aspect. The machines are good at counting. So count things like grammar, vocabulary, go for it. It's really good at it, better than humans. Machines are useless at at estimating content, absolutely useless. No, getting a little better. Machines are now able to say if you're on content or not, if you're on topic or not, more or less. But they're still not very good at telling you how well you've done it. How well have you addressed the topic? How well have you addressed the theme? Machines are not there yet. They're a long way away. I always give the example of Hemingway. If you know your literature, Hemingway compared to Joyce. If you put a piece of writing by Hemingway into any AI system, and I have, believe me, I have tried it. Hemingway comes out at A1 or A2. Because as you remember from Hemingway, if you picture Hemingway writing, the door opened, stop. Stepped in the room, full stop. Slammed the door, full stop. You march to the table, full stop. It's all about atmosphere. The machine has no idea about atmosphere, not a clue. So, all short sentences, A1, maybe A2. James Joyce. I put it in a section from Ulysses, from that last section of Ulysses. I put it in just, a few paragraphs. A1 to A0. Couldn't get it at all. Because dear old Ulysses was all over the place. So as a human reading it, you're thinking, this is a brilliant piece of writing. But there was only one sentence. It happened to be about half a page long. It was just mad. One sentence. I then had the temerity. If you know Gabriel Garcia Marquez, he wrote a very good book called The Autumn of the Patriarch. And he copied the style of the Spanish reports. During the conquistador period in America, the Spaniards in South America had to write a report every time they send gold and silver back to Spain. But of course, they stole about 25% of it, more or less. If they were caught stealing it, they would lose their head and they would lose all of their money and their family would lose everything. So what they would do is they would write a report. And the report might be that thick. But the report would have a full confession. But it was one sentence long. So nobody in the world could read it. You could never find where the person actually confesses to stealing the money. And if they confessed to stealing the money, they wouldn't lose their head and they wouldn't lose their money. They'd just have to give it back. So when they were caught, which did happen, they would simply open the report and say, look, I confessed. You should have read the report. So Gabriel Garcia wrote this paragraph, which was 25 pages long, which was one sentence. And the first sentence says, Pedro was my greatest friend. In the last sentence, he says, we buried Pedro today. And in your head, you think, you killed him. But where? And you read it again, and you can't see it. And you read it again. It takes about 5 times to read it before you figure it out. One sentence. AI, A2. So AI isn't able to understand the creativity, the use of language. It's good at counting. So ask a human to do that bit. Ask a human to look at the interesting bit and ask the machine to do the counting bit that the human isn't good at. That's as far as we would think of going right now. When it came to looking at bias in the system, then we'll go back to bias for a minute and we'll think about what do you do when you find you have a question and you don't know the answer? You Google it. So what did we do? We Googled it. And we found a paper by Margaret Mitchell and a whole bunch of people from what organization? Google. They came up with a really interesting idea. 2019, they suggested this thing called a model card. And a model card was designed to be accessible to ordinary people. You did not have to be a psychometrician. You did not have to be a rocket scientist to be able to read this. This was to be an accessible overview of essentially the validation of your model. Where's the evidence? What you're seeing here now is an overview of what a model card looks like. And you can see, very simple, the model details, the basic information of what type of a model is it, who built it, when was it built, and what is the intended use for the model. Because sometimes people develop a model for one use and then use it for something else, and it's not actually been developed for that purpose. And if it's not been developed for that purpose, you often find that there are issues about it. So you need to know what the intended use of the original model was. Then you look at what factors are likely to have an impact in your context. Now, the things that we've come up with are things like age, gender, accent, whatever. You know yourself what are the things that will cause an issue for an AI scoring system. And remember that the issue for the AI scoring system, it would be the same issues as for, let's say, a foreigner coming to Malaysia, scoring Malaysian students, having heard them for the first time. So you don't need to be an AI specialist to come up with this list. You just need to know your context really well. Then we look at the metrics. What are the measures we use? So do we do it like intra-rater reliability? What are the measures? What are the statistical measures we would use? Then we think about the training data. What data is used to train the system? Because no system works without training. And then what data is used to validate the system or to evaluate it, to find out is it working. Normally we would collect a lot of data and then we would randomly take a bunch of, about maybe up to a third of that data out. We would use the big set to train it and the small set to evaluate it. So essentially, the idea being that it's from a single set of data. And then we think about the ethical considerations. So what are the ethical considerations around using AI? So for example, if you're working in a place where accessibility to internet isn't as good as in other places in your country, is it right to be using it? But that's a question that I can't answer. The model card itself, when it's written, it looks like this. You can see, you don't have to read this, obviously, but you can see that in the model card, we don't have a huge amount of text. If we look at it, it has completed 1, it has completed 2, and completed 3. So essentially, it's about 2 pages long. That's all. This is not designed to be a highly technical report about the system. This is designed to be an accessible report that you can convince people that this is a system that works, and we've shown that it works. Now, what we've tried to do in the British Council over the last while is this model card now is a must. For anybody who's working with us in the area of AI, we insist that they create a model card. And if you want to know more about the model card, a few of us have a chapter coming out in a book in the next couple of months, I think. And if you can't find it, contact me. But the model card is a really valuable tool. It's a very valuable way of looking at things so that we have a way of communicating with the stakeholders that make up our context. So AI then in the learning system. I like to think of learning as a system. So a number of years back, I came up with this idea. I don't think it's mine. I just brought a bunch of other ideas together, and I called it the comprehensive learning system. And for many years, I would talk about the triangle. And loads of people who've seen me talk before know I've done this how many times, where you have the curriculum, the delivery of the curriculum, and the assessment. They all have to be in harmony. The curriculum itself can be the formal and the informal curriculum. We're dealing more and more now, not just with the curriculum, but with the informal curriculum. In other words, the language opportunities and the learning opportunities and the usage opportunities that exist for people outside of the formal education system. Because, as our last speaker very clearly said, there's a lot happening in the world, and there's a lot more opportunity now for language and learning outside of the formal system. We can't just close our eyes, no listening, no speaking, no hearing, whatever. We have to accept this exists. How are we going to deal with it, and how are we going to bring it into our system? So the curriculum, in my opinion, needs to take this into consideration. We have to start thinking about how we can move away from the old formal curricula. I'm not the best person to say how to do it. I'm just the person who raises the question and annoys people who work in the area of curriculum. But it's a question that we really should be thinking of. The curriculum drives the system, of course. So when we think of the delivery of the system, we had a really good talk about professional development of teaching. That's an absolute critical element of the comprehensive learning system. Without that teacher education and continuing professional development, the system cannot work. Because the system will grind to a halt because you're leaving the teachers behind. You can have the most beautiful textbooks. You can have fabulous websites. You can have great assessments. But if you're not bringing the teachers along with you, it's a waste of time. A friend of mine gave me a wonderful comment a few years back. He said, it was a wombat. Now, lots of people think a wombat is a little furry Australian animal, but it's not. It's a waste of money, brains, and time. So it's absolutely critical that we get the teaching right. It's equally critical that we get the materials right. The materials have to fit in with the philosophy of the system. So if we're looking at a system that's there to develop a person's ability to communicate in the language, the materials have got to allow for that, and they've got to encourage that. The teacher training and teacher education has got to teach teachers how to make that happen. We need a physical environment. We can't have desks nailed to the ground. Forget it. We need a proper physical environment to make it happen. We need leadership. So it was really good to hear that as part of the teacher professional development, we have leadership professional development. But that has also got to tie in philosophically with the aims of the curriculum and the aims of the system. If it doesn't, you're wasting your time. Remember, wombat. And it's got to take in informal learning as well. So when we think of informal learning in the curriculum, we have to try to think of how can we reflect that now in our materials. And it may be that we're now looking at things like hybrid learning. So taking a lot of the grammar and vocabulary out of the classroom and putting it online and making it available to learners in a structured way, so that in the classroom you can fixate more on using the language rather than spending 70% of the time learning a couple of words and a couple of grammatical structures, and then 30, if you're lucky, using it. You flip it. So it's the other way around. In the same way, we should be thinking of, okay, if our students have access to these things, what are they doing with the language in that informal learnings? And how can we introduce that? How can we build that into our hybrid learning system? It should be possible. We should be able to build in to the hybrid system links into what they're actually really doing and really interested in, and making that not just a fun activity, but a learning activity, and teaching kids how to turn their playing and their games and their chatting into learning activities. And then moving on to assessment, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about high stakes, summative, or medium stakes, or low stakes, or formative, doesn't matter. Whatever kind of assessment we're talking about, and I'm not a big fan of the summative and formative, because I find that people don't really fully understand what they mean in many ways. I prefer the last line there. Summative, for me, is judgmental. If I give you a summative test, I'm making a judgment about you. I'm putting you into a category. If I'm doing a formative test, I'm not making a judgment. So I would never give you a number for a formative test. I would give you feedback to help your language development. So formative is all about developmental assessment. Summative is all about judgmental effective assessment. I have no problem with either one, but you just have to keep in your head they're not the same thing. And summative, a lot of people say, well, you can give formative advice from a summative test. You cannot. Don't be daft. Anybody with a brain in their head knows if I go into a test, what do I want to do? I want to pass. What am I going to do to pass? Anything I can. And that means bringing in every non-language and every test-wiseness strategy I know or have ever heard of to help me to pass the test. So the test doesn't always reflect my actual language ability. If it's a good test, it will. If it's not a good test, and I can up my score significantly by learning particular strategy, then it's not a good predictor. And giving feedback on that test is a waste of money, another wombat situation. So let's move on to the next one. What the really important part of all of this, if you look at my little triangle, it's now changed, hasn't it? Because it's now changed because a number of years back, I realized the triangle doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context. So my triangle cannot be your triangle. We have to look at the context to understand what that triangle is going to look like, the detail of it. The overall idea will be the same, but the detail, how do I operationalize it? How do I make it happen? So that is going to depend very much, completely, on the context. So for me, when I see people importing without thinking materials, assessments into a system and hoping they work, just because they claim, oh, my test is B1, oh, my book is B1, so they must work. No, they might work together, they might not work together. Do they work in my system? That's the questions that we need to ask. Is this book appropriate? Are the contents of the book appropriate to my system? If they are, brilliant, use it. If they're not, bin it, get another book. We've got to be really careful about how we do it. So when we look at it now within the context, we see that the green box is the technical, like the development model. How do we build the system? And then how do we build measurement into the system? And the measurement isn't just assessment. The measurement is the evaluation of the system. Any good system, it should be evaluated on a regular basis. Within a ministry, for example, there should be monitoring the system and evaluating it at all the time. That needs to be clear, and that needs to be understood. But the big part of it is particularly important in education system and in a learning system is the consequences of changes and innovations within the system are felt by the people who make up the context. Those are the critical things to think about. So when we think about people, we have to think about how can we bring these people along with us? And it's been my experience that we can do it in two ways. One is this concept of a theory of action. So we think of a theory of action is a clearly described agenda for how we're going to make something happen and how it's going to work and what impact it's going to have. And we think about it in terms of our key stakeholder groups, which can be learners, they can be parents, teachers, principals, officials, education officials, right across the board. We've got to think about it. We then need to think about how are we going to communicate this to these people. Up to now, we've had highly technical reports that are submitted to ministries generally, and sometimes read and sometimes filed and never seen again. But the highly technical report has been the report of choice. That's never going to work for parents. It's never going to work for teachers. What we need to be doing is to building communication models where we're thinking right from the beginning of the process, how are we going to communicate this change or this innovation to our stakeholders? How are we going to bring them with us? What is our communication plan? And what type of communication model will we use? We need to be thinking about that. So in terms of the whole process, we need to think about the comprehensive learning system, but within the context of the country, the region, higher education, middle school education. We need to be as close as possible to that context as we possibly can. For the system to work, without that, it's not going to happen. And now I think we can move along from the fairly complicated model, I have to say. But in terms of today, what's the big issue? The big issue is that for any system to work, we need, I believe, a comprehensive system where each of those areas of the triangle are fully aligned. The closer we can bring that alignment together, the more likelihood that that system is going to work. If we neglect any one of those corners, the system will not work. We can be more or less guaranteed. And if it does work, it's a fluke. And it does happen. But generally, the system will not work. We heard a very good example from Singapore, for example. Singapore have a really very good system. And I'll add one line, Dr. Rafi, to your presentation, and that is, not only have they got the teacher training right and the materials right, not only have they got the curriculum right, they've got the assessment right as well. So they've actually got, whether they knew what they were doing or not, and I think they did, they've got a comprehensive system working for them. And it's working for them, and it's working for them, why? Because it's alignment and it's suitable for their context. So you couldn't just import their system into Malaysia and think, oh, this will work. It's working really well there. It's amazing how many countries do that, by the way. It's amazing. You go to things like the Education World Forum, and people, education ministers and advisors are there, and they're looking at presentations and thinking, oh, we should do that in our country. And they're not thinking, would it work in our country? Would it fit conceptually, educationally, socially? You have to ask all those questions, and generally they don't get asked. We only looked really at one corner of the triangle today. We looked at development, we looked at delivery, we looked at scoring. And what did we do with scoring? One more click. We took a small bite out of the corner of scoring. We didn't really look at it in any great depth. We gave it an overview. There's a mountain of work to be done, an absolute mountain of work to be done. It's really exciting. It's really interesting because education is changing. The world of education is changing. It's changing now faster probably than it has since the late 19th century. And what we need to do is to have the courage to deal with the change. So, a few conclusions. Some short though. So what do we think? Now we're at the first thing. I started this, when I wrote this first a few days ago, I said, I know nothing about the presence or absence of bias in any current commercial AI-driven scoring system. And then this morning at about 4 o'clock when I woke up with my jet lag, I changed the I to we, because I don't think any of us has a clue, really. Because we just don't question these things. We really have to work closely with our EdTech partners, and we have to demand more in terms of transparency. We also need, whether we like it or not, to bring in people to our own teams who actually understand how these things work, so that we know, we learn the language of EdTech, we learn the language of how to communicate with those experts, and we try to teach them what we need as well, so we begin to work together, because we can't solve it on our own. The day of developing a test with a bunch of assessment or language experts in a room is gone. It's finished. The new world has a team of people with all kinds of backgrounds. You know, we're working on projects at the moment where we have customer experience people. We have systems design people. We have marketing people. We have test development people. We have project managers. We have technology, AI people. We have platform people. We have a project running right now with all of those people in the room. That's how tests are going to be developed in the future, not like we've been doing it up to now. But in order to make it all work properly, and I will finish on this slide, I hope, we have to start seeing education as a system. It's not just this, I'm a curriculum expert. I'm a curriculum expert within this system, and I therefore have some idea and knowledge and understanding of the other elements of the system. It's useless being a curriculum expert if you have no idea how that is going to be delivered. And I wouldn't say it's completely useless, but it's a waste of time, another wombat, if you don't know something about how it's going to be assessed. But don't create a curriculum and not think about assessment, because how is the curriculum ever going to happen? And the bottom line in terms of AI, in terms terms of fairness, however we define it, ethics, however we define it. Bottom line is we have to open a broad discussion across the entire learning system so that we bring people in from all of these different areas to work together, because the old days are gone, as I just said. We have to work together. We have to bring the different types of expertise together at one table in order to deliver something that's actually meaningful. Now, my very last slide is simply to tell you that if you are around and if you're in Bali in December 9 to 11, we have a conference, New Directions, where we have a whole panel discussion on this whole area. I leave that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Professor Sullivan, for the very insightful, meaningful delivery of how AI, Prof, to be very frank with you, I believe AI has taken us not by storm. Things have changed differently, especially during the pandemic, when we saw technology being used to its maximum. And now when you spoke about AI, artificial intelligence, but I caught one particular aspect of where you mentioned that you were involved in AI 20 years ago.
25.
So 25 years ago. So what was AI like then, in 25 years ago?
It was like Jurassic Park, basically. It was very, very basic. But pre-AI, there was automatic scoring of writing happening in the 1980s. And the first thinking around AI was back in the 1940s. The first paper on artificial intelligence and on machine learning was 1943. So this is something that's been coming for a long, long time. We've not noticed it because it hasn't really impacted much on our lives. But for anybody who owns one of these things, if you own one of these things, you've been dealing with AI since at least 2007. That's when they came in.
Right, exactly.
So they're all around us.
Right, yeah, exactly. I just to share with everyone here, the other day I was in a restaurant and my waiter was an AI robot, right? So, I was a bit delirious as well, ordering food to a robot and expecting the robot to deliver it, later on. But it came on well, Prof. Prof, just going back to your speech short while ago, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, please be prepared with them. I'll start off with the first question, and then we can move on to the audience here. Prof, when you spoke about how personal the exams can be set via AI, and I remembered many years ago when I started into teaching English, we had this term where we mentioned language learning against language acquisition, and then there's a purpose for everything. There's purpose for learning a particular language. So, and earlier when you mentioned that there's a possibility of when the AI learning system is able to detect the as you said, emotions and so forth, can the AI learning system in the future also detect the purpose the speaker uses a particular language?
Yes, we're already working in that area.
Right.
Emotional AI and looking at more than just the basic language that it's delivering. Some really interesting work on that area of emotional AI from mainly the best place around seems to be Sweden for some reason. A lot of interesting work there. But I think I used to talk a lot about personalization. Personalization. And I talk about localization. Localization meaning that an assessment or any part of the CLS triangle needs to be locally applied. So people need to think about, and I didn't really talk about it today because I didn't think it was appropriate, didn't think it was needed, but thinking about the system is always driven by a set of standards. And the standards should drive the curriculum, it should drive the delivery, drive the assessment. And so what did the standards look like? A lot of people turned to this, like happened here. But in some countries, like in China, Japan, and probably up and coming in Taiwan, people are now looking to localizing. So we have a CEFRJ, CSE, China. We have CFRT, calling it. So this concept of localization is important. But ultimately, ultimate localization is where it's localized so much, localized to me, it's personal. And the ultimate goal of introducing AI into, as far as I'm concerned, is to deliver personalized learning. And before I leave this planet, I hope to find a learning system. As we move into digital learning system, when you think about it, if you're involved in digital learning, every time you interact with the system, the data point. So I'm learning about you every time you interact with me. And for me, even though I am a testing person, my first question is, why do you need a test? If you have a really good online digital learning system, you should be able to continuously assess. The measurement and assessment won't go away, but I can certainly see a time when learning becomes more and more hybrid or digital, that we have systems that are test-free. And that would be, as far as I'm concerned, perfect end to my career. I've always said that that's the one thing I would love to do, is to actually kill the test. It would be great, if you could actually do it. We're not that far away from it. We have a project in the British Council where we're actually developing online learning environment where there is no test. We're already doing that. And no, it's not perfect, far from it. And there's still human intervention. So it's still a few years away from working, but that is a future. And that has two issues. One is a positive issue. We can create learning systems that are accessible to everybody and that are personalized for everybody. And that's really positive. But ultimately, as far as I can see, education systems that don't have teachers are never going to be as successful as education systems that are based on machines. The problem that I see, the dystopian view of the future, is that as more and more governments around the world look to a mix of education and economics, educomics or edunomics, I can't remember what the word is. As people are moving in towards the privatization, if you like, of education, it may well be that in the not too distant future, we are finding companies who will be telling governments, you don't need schools, you don't need teachers. You just use our system and you can teach everybody in the country. So what we'll have is we'll have this dystopian system where the people who have no money or have no power will have to learn from these systems. And the people who have the power and the influence and money will have human teachers. They'll have the best of the digital, they'll have the human. Human teacher is critical. I don't believe you can learn with contact and without that drive that a teacher can give. I bet everybody in this room has a teacher that they remember from when they were in school. I do. People that had fantastic influence on me and still do. Like, I had a teacher when I was I'm 67 now. We're talking about a long time ago. I had a teacher in my early years in secondary school, Joss Carroll. I still go to see him when I go back to Thurles. He's 90 now. I still go to see him because he changed my life. I was a dropout. I left school when I was 15. He was the one who talked me back into the system. He was the one who helped me go to college. He did everything for me. So, without teachers, we have nothing.
Thank you, Prof. Anyone from the floor? Any questions to ask Professor Barry Sullivan here? Regards to the delivery of his presentation a short while ago. Yep. Your name, please.
Hello, my name is Muhammad Imran. I'm an intern at ALTC. So I have a few questions because, as we all know, language is an evolving form, right? So, like, nobody here is speaking in Shakespearean English or Old English. So, what do you think the future of AI? How it would we be influencing the AI, or would AI also have an influencing factor in the development of English in terms of grammar or things like that?
I think that's a really good question. And the guy called David Crystal in the UK, who's a very famous linguist, and he's done some, I wouldn't say research on it. He doesn't really do research. He does some really seriously interesting thinking on it. And he would argue, I think, that not even necessarily AI so much as technology itself already has a massive influence. And I see it, when I left Ireland in about 1986, and I moved back this year after 35 years away. And the first thing I noticed was accents. And when I left, a person from the south of Ireland, from Cork, he talked like this. When they would talk up and down, and that's how everybody in Cork would talk. Now they talk like this. And it's a mix of TV and internet. So people are losing those subtle differences and interesting things. The bit I used to love about language was accent. That's already begun to change dramatically as far as I can see. Now, I think when you think about how AI works, in general, it works by scraping the internet. And it does it, most of the scraping happens, and it's not done in a way that encourages the system to focus on modern usage. It tends to look at historical usage. And it's at least theoretically possible that using AI in systems can actually slow down the development of the language. So it could actually be a negative thing. So it's something that we as language specialists need to understand, that it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything. It's something that will help. And if we use it to help what we're doing, that's a sensible way. If we're using it to drive language and drive thinking in the future, well, then that's not such a positive thing, I don't think. And this is from somebody who really is interested in AI and really interested in how we apply it in assessment and in learning systems. My big thing, I ran out of time in my talk. I had a couple of more slides, and one of the slides says, are we too naive about AI in education systems? And the next slide was, yes. We're too naive. We need to think more deeply about it. But it's questions like that we need people to be asking. And those are not questions that are being asked. So please ask that question regularly and start to demand answers, because it's critical that we question everything. Questioning things is a really positive way of moving forward and learning.
True enough, Prof. Yep. True enough. Thank you, Imran. Yes, please. Please proceed to the microphone.
Here,
Yeah.
I'm holding a mic now.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I was looking at it. Okay.
Okay, hi, my name is Miss Putri from PPD Kuantan. I met Dr. Rafi before. Hi, Doctor. Okay, Okay, I totally agree with Prof just now, because I actually developed my own self-learning module using 50 different apps. Okay, one of the apps is Hemingway. Okay, I totally agree with you. When I did with my students, okay, I might be one of the few trainers who has the access to 300 students under my own project, Score A Paya Besar. So, when we were using Hemingway, of course, initially when we started off, we kickstart at level 6. And when we tried to enter all the cohesive devices according to the CFR framework and whatnot, okay, then it jumped into 15, level 15. Then we try to amend, then it starts to drop. Okay, I just want to share with you that actually I could see the success rate for my own students in Kuantan, whereby my project encompasses of 13 different schools in Paya Besar, whereby, just to share with all the audience here, okay, we saw 20% increase of AA+, and also the success rate of passes went through 20 to 30%. I strongly believe that lifelong learning should be instilled among students. And this is what lacking in our system, whereby we are much focused on technique menjawab or just how to answer question papers. But what matters most is study skills, how they equip themselves not to depend so much so on their teachers. They need to be autonomous learners. Then what I truly believe is that that is what is lacking, and that's why I'm here to share tomorrow, and I really hope that it's going to benefit with other teachers as well, because I think that I'm using all the apps for all skills, and at the same time, I'm using the apps for teachers who need to get C1. And when I shared with them, they thanked me that they couldn't figure out, all this while, we have all these apps for free. So my question is that, Prof, how to let other teachers to just join the crowd so that they could not see that this is something tedious, but actually this is doable and workable at the long run. Thank you.
Prof, before that, Prof, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that will be our last question for the day. As I was been prompted earlier that we're supposed to end by 5:30. Nevertheless, Prof.
I'll keep it short then. I go back to the CLS in context model that I talked about. And you need, for me, to get people to buy into a system, you need to think very carefully about their needs and expectations and actually communicate with them from the beginning so that they see what they're gaining from it. That it's, once you have to tell people you're on a losing streak, you've got to get people into the system early and convince them by showing them what the benefits are. And we're all just human beings, so we all need to be told, you know, what's the benefit, what's the value of doing this. And then we also need to think about how we communicate with them. And communicating with people means there are different models of communication, and there's essentially 3 different models of communication, where one of them, we'll go straight to the final one. The final one is interactive communication, where it's genuinely interactive so that people can question you and question the veracity of what you're doing. And you respond not in a defensive way, but in a supportive way. And then it becomes a 2-way interaction. The trouble we have in many cases and many ministries, and it's not always their fault because the ministries sit so far apart from the system itself, is that it's very difficult to set up genuine interactive communication systems between the people who run the ministry and the people who are operational in the classroom. So it's a very important thing, I think, to consider communication from as early on in the system as possible. And if you do, you have a chance of success, and if you don't, you have very little.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think that was a very insightful answer as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry. I'm being very apologetic here because I know we have a very important person on stage who who will be able to give us lots of ideas, current, and I believe what's in store in the future comes to assessment, especially when it's related to AI. Fortunately, time is up. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of the organizing committee, Prof, ELTC, Ministry of Education Malaysia, in fact, for your time, Prof, for being here with us, for delivering such a very, I would say, a very important topic for the future. And Prof, frankly speaking, I love that last statement, the earlier statement, when you were ending your delivery, when you said that what's there for in a test, it has to be, how do I say, embedded within the learning system itself. That it take the stress out of tests, assessments, and so forth. But with having AI in the future, I'm sure we are able to do so. And as you said earlier, that you'll be able to retire happily when it comes to that situation. I'm sure I will be able to do so as well. Prof, I'm sure many of us here will definitely agree. And most importantly, language is creative, and creativity is all about language. I believe all language teachers will agree with me as well. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Let's give Prof. Barry Sullivan a wonderful applause. Thank you very much, Prof.